So the South African National Defence Forces will engage in a multinational maritime exercise with Russian and Chinese navies. That's going to happen next month. The joint exercises will take place near Durban and Richards Bay from the 17th to the 27th of February. Why and what does this mean? Well, Professor Abel Esterhuyse is the Associate Professor of Strategy in the Faculty of Military Science at Stellenbosch University. Prof, thank you very much for availing yourself for us this afternoon. So we understand this is going to be happening as part of Exercise Mossy 2. Which is what and why?
Yeah, this should be seen as exercises that navies engage in for different reasons. Predominantly to exercise their own readiness, firstly, but secondly, and very importantly, these exercises are a very important tool for military diplomacy as well. And I think at the moment, the military diplomacy factor is somewhat in the forefront here.
So let's take a look at the case of Russia, because they're going to be taking part in this exercise while they are engaged in battle against Ukraine. How will they then be showing up for this particular exercise?
Yeah, it was interesting to see the Daily Maverick describing the exercise this morning in terms of smoke that blunders and an exercise in obscenity. That's quite harsh judgment on the exercise. But I think what is important here is perhaps the context that one uses if you judge this exercise, or the glasses that you are putting on to look at this exercise. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. You know, if one use and consider the historical and perhaps the ideological context, then of course you see the ANC and the former Soviet Union that is coming into context. If one talks about this exercise within the context of BRICS, well, then one can argue that this is an annual exercise, that this year India and Brasilia, for whatever reasons, are not participating in the exercise this year. Perhaps seeing this as strategic or a military perspective, where one can simply argue that different navies are participating with the South African Navy in exercises for different reasons. We've seen the French, the Royal Navy, the US Navy, different navies from around the world participating with the South African exercises. But as I said, I think the military context, the military diplomatic context is very important here to consider. And of course, then we need to look at South African foreign policy that's coming into play. And then a whole new dynamic unfolds that one may talk about in terms of the war in Ukraine.
Let's get into it, Prof.
Yeah, well, there's simply a question of timing, the timing of this exercise with the war that is unfolding in Ukraine. There's, of course, the question of South African foreign policy that's based on universal principles of human rights. And then the exercise raises questions about Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the one hand, but also the way that Russia is conducting that war. And of course, then questions of human rights abuses and South Africa not condemning the war and the invasion in the first place, and secondly, also not condemning Russia's conduct thereof. So then there's, I think, quite a number of questions that one needs to ask here. You know, how South Africa, for example, responded in the past to invasions. Let's talk about the NATO invasion of Libya, or the NATO use of force in Libya. What makes the Libyan and the NATO use of force in Libya different from the Russia's use of force in Ukraine? And yet South Africa has clearly expressed themselves on NATO's use of force in Libya. There's another question about, let's say the US conducted and would have conducted the war in Afghanistan in the way that the Russians are doing it in Ukraine, would the South African government have responded in a different way? And then lastly, I think there's a question of what is the message that South Africa is sending to the rest of the world by participating with Russia in a naval exercise? Specifically when the biggest part of the democratic and the free world at this stage has serious questions about Russia's use of force in the Ukraine.
Yeah, Prof, I think my guess, just listening to what you have outlined so far, is that perhaps the first logic that you spoke to us about, this being part of an annual BRICS exercise, would probably suffice as an explanation. But that's just my guess. Don't quote me on that. And let me take a look. Yeah, sure. Can
I just raise another question here? And I think this is a very important question that one has to consider, and that is the question of what is in it for Russia? What are the Russians getting out of this exercise? What is the Russian takeaway from this exercise? And keeping in mind that Russia at present is diplomatically, militarily, economically very isolated and in search of partners and friends in the rest of the world. And I think that's a very important question to ask at this very moment.
What's in it for China? They're also quite close to
What Russia. Is in it for China? It's critical questions to ask.
Let's take a look then at South Africa and how we're going to be showing up for this exercise. How should we understand our Navy's contribution to the exercise? And maybe you can give us a sense of some of the challenges that are plaguing our Navy?
Yeah, I don't want to dwell too much on the challenges facing our Navy. I think the challenges facing our Navy are well known. We know that our military in general is struggling with a budget. We know that our military at the moment is struggling to do the necessary maintenance that ought to be done and to maintain, to sustain our ships in a general state of readiness. I think that's a well-known fact. And of course then on the negative side, and because of the lack of a proper budget, there's also questions about the readiness of our personnel and equipment for this exercise. But then at the positive side, one has to look at them now getting the opportunity to go to sea again, to get some sea time and spend some time at sea on their ships. And I think that's a very positive thing and that one should embrace in a positive way.
Prof, is there a charge or is there a cost? How much is this costing South Africa? And if there is, if we do a cost-benefit analysis, is it worth it?
I have no doubt that it is worth doing these kind of exercises. You're getting a lot of experience out of this. You're getting a lot of training out of this. You're benefiting a lot from these kind of exercises. One needs to keep in mind that navies in general are a very international tool for diplomacy. And so there's a lot of positive cooperation that's coming from this. And one has to consider the BRICS context here, that South Africa is building very close relationships with the BRICS countries. And the BRICS have not been created as a military alliance per se, but it has become quite an important part of BRICS over the long run.
Prof, good to see you and thank you. Happy Friday to you. Professor
Thank you so much.
Abel Esterhuyse, Associate Professor of Strategy in the Faculty of Military Science at Stellenbosch University.